studying the Romantics. Tomorrow we'll be moving on to Victorians. So, the Romantic period is, kind of a favorite. It's only a little political, and really Mary Wollstonecraft is kind of moving into the Victorian era. She kind of signals a moment of, transition for history. But I think that there's like a sigh of relief with the Romantics, and we can just sort of like revel in the words and the ideas of nature without having the heavy concentration of the political that we see on both sides of the Romantic era with the 17th century, 18th century stuff with political satire, and then into the Victorian era where there are a lot of serious issues in society that get addressed in literature. So this is our last time with the Romantics. Today we're going to talk about A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, just the introduction part, because it's a longer pamphlet. What they used to do in the late 18th century is sort of publish their political views in pamphlets, which were sort of, like folded paper essays, and publish them in, maybe they're 20 pages long, 30 pages long. So we're just reading the introduction, which I think is fine because the pamphlet later goes into more detail with examples and things like that. But we're sort of like reading her thesis. If you want to, I'm going to go through my notes on the text of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and I'm going to be using this little PDF booklet of just this passage. So if you want your own copy of that and you want to annotate it, or if you want to keep it in your Google Drive, you can get a copy of just this selection with the biographical information on Mary Wollstonecraft. You can get that right here in the readings for Unit 4, right down here. So if you want to follow along and make your own notes, then you can do that with that document. I know I always mention Cami. That's the app that I use to annotate text that I'm going to go through with you today. If a question pops up in the chat, you can let me know. I know what I wanted to do. I wanted to go through the calendar before we started. So today we're ending the Romantics, and there is a study guide for this passage. And maybe at the end, after I go through my notes on it, maybe we'll look at the study guide and see if there's anything outstanding that you want me to talk about, anything that you feel from the study guide that you need more explanation on. We'll do that at the end of the period. Tomorrow is probably going to be a fairly short period. I'm going to do the usual lecture on the Victorian era, talk about how we're moving into a new time period and what that time period entails in terms of literature and history. And I'll also be talking about essay number 2. I was looking at essay number 2, by the way, and there's a couple things I want to change on it to make it a little bit easier. They, I don't know. I think that the people at STC and the English department sometimes on purpose make things harder than they need to be. So I'm going to go in and do some tweaks, and I'll introduce that essay to you tomorrow. So if you did look at it already, there'd be a few changes. The main topics are the same, but I'm going to do some things to make it a little bit easier to do the research. And I know that everybody's, it's the time of the year where everybody's getting jammed up with projects and exams and all that stuff. So I want to make it easier for you to do that paper. And I'll look at that tonight and introduce it to you tomorrow. But let's go to the document. If you're just joining us, you can get this same document that I'm going to be going through in the reading section of the unit, right here where it says PDF booklet. I know I mentioned that last time. So I made a booklet just of this passage, and that's what I'm going to be annotating. So I like Cami. It it saves everything for me right into my drive automatically, so I think that's pretty good. You should read a little bit of the background information on the authors. I know I mentioned this at the beginning of the term, but I did get a question on the formatives yesterday because I always make you ask me a question about the material. Someone asked me if they need to, like, to what extent do I need to really know the background material on the authors? And I'm going to say to not a very great extent. I do think that you should read it. I think understanding how the person was raised and their education and, you know, that sort of thing is helpful to kind of basically inform their perspective. But I'm not going to ask you questions about, you know, the lineage of an author or, you know, the only thing you would really need to know is what time period do the authors belong to. So like when I do those slideshows at the beginning of a new unit, usually at the end there are some authors from that period that are kind of like key thinkers and writers at the time. So that you need to know. But I don't think you need to go through and memorize, you know, Mary Wollstonecraft's life story. Just honestly, I don't think you do. There aren't questions like that on the final exam. But you know, a lot of her attitudes that we see just in the little passage that we read of her work show up in her writing, you know, come up from her background. So sometimes it's good to see that and to understand that sometimes the way a person's life path continued leads them to some of their conclusions that they write about. So, or some of the perspectives that they're using in their writing. So it's kind of hard for us to separate in some cases, most cases, history and literature, because a person doesn't write in a vacuum. A person writes in you know, societal situation, and that depends on their own personal upbringing and society at the time and the expectations and beliefs of people. So you know, that way of looking at literature is pretty common and valid. We don't look only at the historical aspects, but you know, a woman wouldn't have to write this article today. And it's kind of important to, well, at least in America. In other places in the world, yes, a woman would need to write this article. Still, there are places in the world that are that behind in their thinking about equality. But I guess my point is that it's good to have a background to understand the perspective of the writer. So that's why we read that information. We don't read it to take scrupulous notes and memorize all of the background material of the authors. If this was a course that was just on the Romantic period, then yeah, we might delve a little bit more into that background. But this is a broad ranging course, so I don't think you need to um, make tons of notes and analyze to that point, if that makes sense. Because somebody asked me about that. All right, so let me go through the piece. I know this is a little bit of a challenge to read, mainly because of vocabulary, but also because of sentence structure. A lot of writers in the end of the 18th century and even into the 19th century, and you'll see this also in the Victorian era, have very long sentence structures. And it's common at this time to see extremely long sentences. For example, this first sentence of the introduction of this piece ends here. And a lot of sentences are long, which makes them a little bit more complex to read. Plus, you're trying to follow a philosophical point and the rhetorical moves that the author's making in this particular piece, because it's not a piece of fiction, it's a piece of nonfiction that is set up to make a point. So, in order to follow that point, you've got these long sentences and then the vocabulary. So I know that this is more of a challenge to read than, you know, than poetry in some ways. But I'm going to go through it, and hopefully you picked up on some of the same things that I'm going to note. If not, you might want to make a note on those things or add to your notes what you might not have. So in terms of historical literature, this piece is prominent in a way that no other piece is prominent in literature. A Vindication of the Rights of Women is Mary Wollstonecraft's most famous writing. She wrote many things, but this is her most famous piece of writing because it's the first time that we have in writing a woman who is making an argument for the proper and complete education of women. And it's about mainly about education rights, the right for a woman to educate herself as a man is educated. It's not an argument, although it's considered a feminist tract, it's not an argument for general rights of women, although she does touch on that. In general, the point is that a woman ought to be able to improve herself through education just as a man does. Because at this time, the historical background tells us that women were not educated to be thinkers, women were educated to be pleasing and to be wives. And even wealthy women were not given the same education as their brothers because they weren't, because their end result of their life was going to be to raise children and look pretty at parties and plan social events. So if that's the role of women in society, then why do women need to go and study mathematics or understand science or any of those things? So the mindset needed to start to shift, according to Mary Wollstonecraft and many other women, into the idea that, separating gender roles like that is problematic for society. And so this piece, that's what she's trying to explain, how women shouldn't be held back from their studies and studying the same things that men are allowed to study just because of their gender. So there's a couple points I want to make as I go through, and some vocabulary that I think it's key to understand. The first one is vindication. Vindication is a really specific word, and this is not the first time that Mary Wollstonecraft used it. She wrote another piece previous to this called A Vindication of the Rights of Man. And she doesn't mean man like the male gender, she means man like human beings, mankind. And in this piece, even in the part that we read in the introduction, she makes that distinction. And she says, look, sometimes we say men and we mean all people. And that's a problem of syntax. That's a problem that we created for ourselves by making the word man sometimes mean a male person and sometimes meaning human. And so she uses that in this piece to explain why women are part of mankind. And so anyway, in her previous piece, she writes about maybe it's time to dismantle the aristocracy, maybe it's time to look into more Republican type values, maybe it's time to think about more equality for all human beings. And she was responding to another writer, which is what these pamphleteers did. They would read each other's works and argue philosophical and political points. So when she writes A Vindication of the Rights of Women a couple years later, this is specifically a tract that is designed to bring up the idea that women should be allowed, and actually society needs women to pursue their intellect to whatever level they would like, instead of being limited to what society expects that they need to learn, right? And that's sort of like the summary of the piece. So in the introduction, she makes several points. I'm going to point them out to you, but maybe you already made notes on them. So one of the first points she makes is that obviously men and women are different. There are a couple of concessions that she makes. I'm assuming that you studied that last year in rhetoric. There are a couple of concessions that she makes in terms of how women are physically weaker than men. I mean, that's just a fact of life. She can't get around that. So she concedes it. And she says, I'm not talking about physical strength. I'm not talking about being able to do sports or till fields. I'm not talking about how much you can deadlift. I'm talking about the mental acuity of all human beings. So she says, all right, I'm not denying that there's a difference between us, but when it comes to the subject of education, there shouldn't be a difference between us. And I think that we kind of take for granted because we have schools where male and female students are on par and can take whichever classes they want and study whatever they want in college. We kind of take that mindset for granted. And looking back on this piece, we can kind of see how frustrating it might have been. What if you're a really intelligent woman in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and nobody's going to let you go to school? You know, if you're wealthy, you can read books or get tutors, but that's kind of frowned upon. You're just supposed to, look beautiful and wear nice gloves and, put on your hat. And that would be very demeaning to you. It would be, like it's sort of like when if they said to you in eighth grade, okay, all the boys are going to high school, you girls are going to go to sewing school so that you can be good housekeepers for your family. How demeaning and frustrating is that, right? And so Mary Wollstonecraft is one of those people. And she says, I think that the whole misunderstanding has originated from one hasty conclusion. And I highlighted that because she says the idea that women are only around for their beauty or to be companions is old fashioned. And she uses this flower metaphor to explain that. And she says, women, if they're planted in the right soil, can flourish. It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you only expect women to sit at parties and look cute, and that's all that they need to do in their lifetime, then that's all that you're going to expect of them. It's like if you plant a plant in weak soil that doesn't have any nutrients, the flower is going to be kind of weak. And then you're going to say, oh, those flowers are weak. But if you plant that plant in healthy, rich soil, then it can grow to its potential. And she uses that metaphor to explain that if all you want to do is make, I underline this part, alluring mistresses and affectionate wives, rather than affectionate wives and rational mothers, then you will plant women in weak soil and give them embroidery to do and nothing that challenges their mind and their intellect and helps them to grow. So she uses this flower metaphor here to make that point. And maybe you look at women now and you say, oh, they're kind of dumb and they don't understand the things that men understand. Well, maybe that's because they've never had a chance, right? You're seeing the end result of something that was put into place because of this inequality. She goes on to make some arguments. Here's where she continues her concession. If you haven't marked those things, I think you should, just as a point of refreshing your study of rhetoric. She makes the concession here that here's where she says that men are physically stronger than women. You cannot deny that. That's true even today. Their potential and their physical strength is greater than that of women. But she said there's a concession and then a rebuttal, but she says just because somebody is physically strong doesn't mean that that makes them, superior to anyone else in the terms of intellect. She makes this argument, and I put a note here on the side to remind me. She makes this argument. The argument is women, if we give them equality, they'll be too masculine. They'll be too much like men, and men want a wife that is, able to dominate them. They'll be too male oriented, and we'll just have a whole society of men. And her response is, well, it's not about making women more masculine. Like you're equating education with masculinity when you don't need to do that. You can just equate masculinity with the figure of a man, and anybody can improve their intellect. Just because you're smart doesn't mean that you're not nurturing as a mother or whatever. So it's not about blurring the line between femininity and masculinity. It's about enabling every human being to reach their potential as they decide they want to do that, right? And she says, men endeavor to sink us still lower. Why do you have to take a woman who's already physically weaker and make her even more weak by denying her the ability to grow in her intellect? Here's where she makes the point about the difference between, the sort of denotative element of the word man. The idea that man can mean a male person, but it can also mean mankind. So it's important to distinguish, where are we talking about masculinity there? And so she says that's kind of the crux of the argument, that if we're talking about male people, they have certain qualities. But if we're talking about mankind, then we're talking about everybody, and that includes women. And it also includes people on various social scales. Later in her pamphlet, she goes into that. She mainly sticks with middle class women because she says that they're the least trying to accomplish something. And so she sticks with them mainly here in the introduction, but later on she starts talking about the strata of society and women within those situations. This is where she says that right here. I think this is an interesting line right here where she says, "My own sex, I hope, will excuse me." This is on page 6 of the document. "My own sex, I hope, will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone." So she addresses the women who might be reading her pamphlet, which is a pretty interesting rhetorical move. There's sarcasm there, obviously. She says, "Excuse me, I hope you don't mind if I treat the women who might be reading this as if they have a brain." And so obviously you can see the sarcasm in that. But what it implies is that, oh, did you think that women don't read these pamphlets, these political things that all of you men write? Women do read them, and women will be reading this one too. Like, it's not written just for a male audience. And then she goes on to persuade women to endeavor to require strength of both mind and body, and to convince them that the soft phrases, susceptibility of heart, delicacy of sentiment, and refinement of taste are almost synonymous with epithets of weakness. And that those beings who are only the object of pity and that kind of love, which has been termed its sister, will soon become objects of contempt. In other words, I want to, for the women who are reading this, I want you to pursue your strengths. And that's why I'm writing this piece. That things like being delicate and, calm and all of that stuff is, associated with female, but I want to add to that and say also full of intellectual promise. You can still be all those things. She also makes a point about her writing here in the introduction. Now remember, this is the introduction, so she's just laying out her argument. This whole part that we read is like a thesis. So later on, she's going to go into more depth about all of these different topics. But she makes a point about her writing, and which we probably find intellectually stimulating. But she says, if you find that my writing is inferior in some way, just keep in mind that I'm here to make a point, and my clarity of my point is more important than the poetry of my words. So, those of you who are getting ready to criticize me for not having the perfect level of writing acumen, just know that my goal here was not to be flowery. My goal here was to have an opinion and express it clearly. One of the strongest arguments that I think that she makes here in the introduction is how detrimental it is to have uneducated women, in terms of in the middle class, women who have just been raised to be cute playthings and, party planners and, people who sew. Now, there are women who just like doing that. But she says we need women who are raising children to be intelligent. We need those women to be smart, and we need them to raise their children in ways that indicate that, so that the children can also grow. And we need a society that's moving and growing and improving. And how can that happen if the mothers are mainly kept in a childlike state? by being cute and not educated. If they desire to do that, then that's fine. But she says, what about all the ones that desire more? So she said, how can they be expected to govern a family with judgment or take care of the poor babes whom they bring into the world if they don't have reason and logic? This is the ending part right here of the intro. And she touches on an element that she goes into much more depth about in the pamphlet itself. But she says, if we raise women just to be cute and we don't give them the opportunity to expand their mind, then what is their role after they're done being cute? I mean, time is going to take its toll, and there's going to be a point where women lose their youthful glow. And if that's all that you've looked at, then they're useless to society. But a woman who has taken the opportunity to expand her mind and grow and learn will be wise. And when she's not an object of desire any longer, then she says here, even rational men will understand that they can be respectable in their intellect. You know, so what are you going to do with a woman who had like that flower that's been planted in the weak soil once the flower's gone and it's just a stick sticking out of the ground? What use is it to you? Toward the end here, there are a few lines of importance. She says, what if we meet in the middle, right? Like, what if some of the qualities that we now kind of strictly call masculine and the ones that we strictly call feminine, what if we started to kind of adapt some of each other's descriptors? She says, let men become more chaste and modest, which are female qualities. And if women do not grow wiser in the same ratio, it will be clear that they have weaker understandings. So if we try to meet in the middle, if women don't actually grow in their intellect, if we don't see women being able to handle these educational nuances that men do, then we'll know for a final fact, like it's an experiment, we'll know for a final fact that men are capable of way more intellectual strength than women. But if we don't try, we'll never know, basically. So the piece in general is laying out her argument. Are there any questions on my notes in this passage that you want me to talk about? I know I went through that kind of quickly. All right, I'm going to open the study guide. Is there anything, hopefully you already had a look at the study guide, but if you didn't, then you can kind of scroll through there now. If there's anything that you want me to talk about in terms, you know, any of these study questions. Some people I know, they go through and they make notes based on the study guides. Some people don't, you know, that's up to you. But some people want additional notes so that they can add to them. I think kind of like Wife of Bath, way back in the medieval times, in her prologue where she talks about some of these same issues. We have not a lot of women writers to thank for the situation that we're in today, where women, at least in many countries, have the right to pursue an education. That is not true all over the globe. Just FYI, there are places where women are not allowed to pursue a formal education. And these arguments are still being made. But for those of us who have the ability to apply to college and earn degrees and pursue a field of study that we're interested in and make a career for ourselves, we have these early pieces to thank for that. And it's kind of hard for us to imagine a society where that wouldn't be happening, but they existed in history and still do today. So I think historically, this is a significant piece for this time period, and it signals a move into the Victorian era where we do start to see more educational opportunities for women, not just because of Mary Wollstonecraft, but because of also the, the suffrage movement that spawns right about this time and the French Revolution. I don't see anything in the chat. So, if anything comes up, you can communicate with me about it with this text. Hopefully I didn't go through that too quickly. Tomorrow we're going to talk about, I'm going to do the intro to the Victorian era, and we'll talk about essay number 2. And I think today's a little bit short, and I think that tomorrow will be a little bit short too in the same way. So that's good. We have 3 B days this week and 1 A day, so I don't know how that worked out. Any questions? Anything else before I sign off? We do not have a discussion this week. Discussion number 7 is next week, and that's over Romanticism. So we're closing that out today and moving on. And next week we'll continue with the Victorian era. Maybe I talked too fast. All right. I'm going to go ahead and end class. I hope that you all have a good day, and I will see you tomorrow morning. Bye.